I'd like to make this point with regard to the economy in general, that everything must be subject to measurement. The only way we're going to come out of this difficulty is by making everything subject to measurement. We cannot afford to be wedded to outdated ideology. And whether something's in private ownership or public ownership is irrelevant to me once it works. If a hospital survives better in private ownership, if a school is better in private ownership, if a local service is better in private ownership, let it be. Equally, if it's better in public ownership, let it be. And we should be prepared to take services away from organisations that aren't efficient. And Susie, the operation to third level grants, no one can actually stand over the inefficiency and complete mess that that organisation has made of third level grants. It's totally unacceptable that we have families out there waiting 6-7 months after their children have started college and have no word on their grant. Totally unacceptable. We should have, after 2 or 3 months, we should have brought in emergency legislation, took it off them and gave it to some other body. There's plenty of organisations out there would do it. Totally unacceptable. Equally, we've got to look at labour law. Many companies have their hands tied with employees that are inefficient due to our labour law. They're afraid to address it due to the raft of labour law we have out there. Equally, we've got to have measures in place, be it education, retraining, upskilling for people who are unemployed. I'm a great advocate of workfare instead of welfare. I have been for a number of years, and I know we're going slowly down that road, and it's very, very welcome because people want to work. They want an opportunity to make a contribution. It contributes to their self-esteem, it contributes to the economy, it contributes to society as a whole. And you know, every cause has its merits, but there's a certain limit of funding. You know, the European Union contains somewhere in the region of 10% of the population, yet we spend somewhere in the region of 50% of the world's welfare budget. So we've got to look at good causes, value for money. So in summation, Cathaoirleach, I'd like to say, again, the Gettysburg Address, 272 words. The EU directives on eggs, 10,000 words. So hopefully someone might help me and check out that, the latter statistic. But I believe there's a lesson to be learned there. More action, less words, less talks. Thank you very much, Cathaoirleach.
The next speaker is Deputy OD. Deputy, 20 minutes.
Thanks very much, Cathaoirleach. It's always very difficult to follow Deputy Timmins, but I just wanted to know that I had a quick look at section 24, and your reading is exactly correct. Your reading of section 24 is correct. That relief is reduced from 80% to 50%. Anyway, the finance bill, the purpose of the finance bill, I suppose, is to put into legislative form the changes, particularly the tax changes contained in the budget. And usually there are a number of other changes as well, and this finance bill, like others, contains a number of other changes, most of them very marginal, I have to say. Some of them I welcome, insofar as they go. The budget itself, it must be said, did very, very little indeed to tackle the main two ills which are confronting Ireland socially and economically. The massive and growing unemployment crisis and the lack of credit, which is causing much of the unemployment crisis. The official statistics, which don't always tell the full story, show that 14.6% of the population are unemployed. Say for people under 25, the figure would be over 30%. But unfortunately, the official statistics don't tell the full story. The official statistics are masked by the fact that there's a whole lot of schemes, social employment schemes, community employment schemes, etc., all very worthwhile in their own way, and many of which I support and I can see the necessity for, but they do tend to mask the full rate of joblessness in this country. Of course, what also masks the full rate of joblessness in this country or conceals the true unemployment situation is the fact that many people are now hiding out, as it were, in the education system. People are staying on further in the education system because there's no prospect of employment there. And the really worrying thing about even the official statistics is that every time the unemployment figure is announced, it's announced on a monthly basis, the proportion of people who are defined as long-term unemployed grows inexorably. We're at a stage now where I'm sure well over 50% of the people who are officially unemployed in this country fall into the category of long-term unemployed. And that is a social, it is a personal, it is an economic tragedy for this country. Of course, the thing that more than anything else masks the true rate of unemployment or lack of job opportunities in the country are the starting levels of immigration. And, you know, quoting the department's own figures, last year, over 70,000 people left these shores. Now, no doubt there are some who would have us believe that it was all voluntary and they wanted to see the seven wonders of the world. But in fact, in my experience anyway, and I'm sure the deputies on the other side of the House will share this experience, the vast majority, the vast overwhelming majority, 99% of the people who are leaving this country, immigrating from this country, are doing so because they can't find a job here at home. Now, when you think about the figure of over 70,000, it's a startling figure. It's 1,400 per week, 200 per day, Now, many of those 200 per day who are leaving this country are people who have been highly educated, education dearly paid for by the taxpayers of this country. And they're the very sort of people who have the sort of skills, the sort of education, the sort of expertise that we badly need in this country to lift the country out of the economic morass in which it is at the moment. And the fact that they have to leave the country and go overseas to get work is a real tragedy. But it does, my main point is that it does tend to mask the true rate of joblessness in the country. The other difficulty confronting business in this country, employment creation, people in the domestic economy who want to create jobs, SMEs, the other difficulty confronting them, of course, is the lack of credit. This country is starved of credit. In the mid-1840s, we had a great potato famine. For the last number of years, we've suffered a great credit famine. The fact of the matter is that the Minister for Finance, by his own admission, has stuffed the banks with capital. He stuffed the banks with capital, taxpayers' money. The objective of doing that was not because we like the banks or not because they're venerable institutions that need to be preserved or national monuments or anything like that. The reason why this money was put into the banks was to enable them to extend credit to business, because credit is the lifeblood of business, and get the economy and employment moving again. They have failed abysmally to do so. Nobody can dispute that. Nobody who's looking at this from the outside, nobody who's looking at this objectively can deny that. They have failed abysmally to do so. I'll give you one example. The stated target, stated to me on a number of occasions by Minister Richard Bruton, a number of other ministers, including the Minister for Finance, Michael Noonan, was that in 2012, the target was 8 billion new lending for the pillar banks. 8 billion new lending. Now, the pillar banks did lend 8 billion in 2012. Yeah, they've lent 8 billion, but only 2.5 billion was new lending. The rest was mere turnover, mere continuation of loans that were already out there, continuation of the facility for another year. And in the same period, 2012, the amount, we're talking about lending now to SMEs, the amount which the banks took in, the pillar banks took in from SMEs by way of repayments was 4.5 billion. So we have 2.5 billion new lending, 4.5 billion repayment. So therefore, the amount of credit available to SMEs from the pillar banks in the year 2012 actually contracted by 2 billion. And that's a fact. And, you know, the banks are still engaged in an Orwellian exercise to get people to disbelieve the evidence of their own eyes and ears and pretend that everything is normal. The latest argument is the old chestnut resurrected, that, you know, look, we're prepared to lend, but people aren't looking for money. They're not looking for credit. Of course they're not looking for credit. They're not looking for credit because people in the business who are looking for credit will tell them that the bank will say, we have money available to lend to you, but the conditions they will put in are so stringent and so hard to overcome that there's no point in applying or putting yourself to the trouble or expense of applying in the first place. And that's the reality. So I would say to the government that, you know, 2 years down the road, they really have to now apply some direct pressure on the banks. And I'm glad to see that there are some moves taking place in that regard. Because, you know, what has been happening for the past 2 years is the Taoiseach seems to feel that, you know, acting like a latter-day King Canute and ordering the banks, or suggesting to the banks that they might change their policy and actually advance credit, that patently hasn't worked. Now, as I said, there's a number of things in the finance bill which I welcome, but, you know, somebody looking at this economy, looking at the context in which we are debating this bill, would wonder to what extent are we detached from reality. There's various improvements in the finance bill. For example, you have a provision that says that airport hangars will now be treated as industrial buildings in order to attract accelerated capital allowances. That's, from the point of view of Shannon Airport, which is in my neighbourhood, I welcome that. But, you know, one wonders what contribution that's going to make to the 440,000 people who are looking for jobs in this country and the 200 per day who are immigrating. I, of course, welcome the extension. I must declare an interest here, not necessarily an interest, but I must declare the fact that I was one of the many people who lobbied for this. I welcome the extension of the fuel rebate to include coach and tour operators and hauliers. I do welcome that. But however, I would like to remind the Minister that there are other businesses which use their own fleets, some catering businesses, for example, some concrete manufacturing businesses. Now, apparently, from my reading of the legislation, if it is correct, the rebate doesn't extend to those, so therefore there is a disadvantage vis-à-vis larger operators, and I would like the Minister to have a look at that. The changes in the R&D reliefs, you know, the definition of key employee, etc. I know that somebody made the point that there was no accurate measurement of the potential impact of this on investment in R&D. Well, in fairness to the Minister, I don't think that could be. I don't think it's possible to measure, but it is a step in the right direction. And I welcome the small steps, small though they are and incremental though they are, changes in the tax regime relating to R&D, because, you know, we're seriously in danger of falling behind here. Other countries have latched onto this. Other countries have made their R&D systems very, very attractive from the tax point of view, and we urgently need to encourage more investment in here. Now, I've said, and I repeat, and I've no difficulty putting it on the record, Minister Noonan is moving in the right direction in this regard, but he's moving far too slowly. I'm totally opposed to Section 8 of this bill, which for the first time in history imposes a tax on maternity benefit. Now, you must take this in conjunction with the cuts in child benefit over the last 2 budgets, and indeed the cuts over the last 2 business in back to school clothing allowance. It's an attack on children, an attack on women. There's a lady called Niamh O'Callaghan, who is spokesperson for a leading parents group, and she said, when this was announced in the budget, it's as if the government don't want women to have children, unquote. This provision will affect 46,000 people, and it will yield 40 million for the government's coffers. That means that on average, a woman who happens to get pregnant will on average be €833 worse off. But what I object to most, or I object to equally in this provision, is the spurious reason given during the budget speech for this introduction. We were told that there was a lacuna in the law. This was one of the benefits that wasn't taxed. One of the state benefits that wasn't taxed. There was a lacuna in the law. Well, I mean, we lived with it. We lived with it for a long, long time. And suddenly, when the country is on its knees, when people are literally struggling to get by from week to week, we discover that we've fallen in love with the idea of uniformity in the tax system. So we introduce it. The provisions on retail investment, the provision to provide groups for that, I welcome that. I mean, I wonder how effective it will be in practice. I imagine that there'll be very few of them in the country. I mean, because the company has to be quoted in the stock market, and taking into account the expense of being quoted in the stock market, I doubt if we'll see more than 1 or 2 in the country. However, it does move in the direction of other countries, and it may attract some foreign capital into an industry that has literally run into the ground. Minister Noonan also announced that when he gets consent or permission from the European Union, he's going to introduce a scheme to enable people to repair their houses and repair retail shops in certain city centre areas. Now, the two cities chosen were Limerick and Waterford. Now, I have to be pretty careful what I say here because I represent the Limerick constituency in conjunction with Minister Noonan. What I will say is this, any concession that's coming to Limerick, I welcome, because Minister Noonan explained that this wasn't just a stroke, that he wasn't just giving money to us, his own constituency. He explained there was a very good scientific basis for this, and I agree. He based it on the level of unemployment, and that Limerick is the unemployment black spot in this country. Unemployment in Limerick City is running at 28.2%. 28.2%. Youth unemployment in Limerick City is running at over 50%. Now, that's the constituency represented both by myself and the Minister for Finance and the Minister for Housing. Unemployment 28.2%, almost double the national average. And I know lots of people who live in the inner city area of Limerick which will be subject to this tax relief. They live in pretty shabby, run-down, derelict houses, and they're in a very poor position to repair them. They could do with a bit of assistance from the taxpayer or whoever. I'm very surprised that the assistance that's going to be forthcoming will be confined to people living in Georgian piles, because I've represented this constituency for a long, long time, and there are people living in Limerick city centre who are a hell of a lot poorer than people who happen to be living in Georgian houses in Limerick. So I think from that point of view, Georgian houses, they look well, they add to the tone of the area. But I mean, the minister now who knows the city pretty well would know that that there are many others rather than people who dwell in Georgian houses who could do with a bit of assistance, and it would certainly improve the aspect of the city. In relation to the other part of that concession, the assistance to retailers to do up their shops, well, it'd be difficult enough to operate this in Limerick because, as far as I can see, most retail units around the city centre have closed down. I mean, the place is a shambles. Incidentally, I have been approached at the weekend by one or two people who were minded to take over derelict shops and do them up, and they asked me to find out how this tax relief was going to operate and when it was going to come into effect. So I made inquiries from the Department of Finance, and I spoke to some very courteous officials in there who told me that with the necessity to get European consent, it'll be at least 12 months before it comes on stream, and there is little or no chance that it'll be retrospective. So when I went back and told my constituents that, given the bad news, they said, OK, we won't go ahead at all now, we'll wait. So instead of acting as an incentive to do something with the retail sector, run-down retail shops in Limerick, this is actually beginning to act as a deterrent, which I'm sure wasn't intended. Again, I welcome the provisions for early access to pensions, but I have to say that they are too restricted. I mean, they're unlikely to make very little difference because they exclude the self-employed, the people who would be most likely to benefit from those, the people who would most likely to take down capital which they would put into the economy, are the self-employed, who are the very people that are excluded from these schemes, and that will reduce their effectiveness very, very severely indeed. The increases in the health insurance levy, well, that comes at a time when the sector has been driven to the brink of collapse, literally. I deplore the provision which scrapped the €127 PRSI exemption for those earning over €352 per week. This means that people who are just over 18,000 a year will be hit in the same way as people who are earning a multiple of that. It is a blunt, unfair and regressive provision. And I find it deeply ironic that a government that includes the Labour Party couldn't bring themselves to impose an extra charge on universal social charge, an extra 3%, on the share of income of people earning over €100,000 per annum. And yet they could bring themselves to impose an extra £5 a week tax, an extra €264 per annum on people earning 18,000. In addition, I don't see anything in the finance bill, not that I hear anything in the budget, about pensions payable to senior civil servants, senior bankers and senior politicians. The level of those pensions has scandalised the public. People who are literally struggling from week to week. Is the government aware of those credit union surveys that show that people who are supposed to be on respectable incomes, people like guards and nurses, when they pay their bills, they have little or no disposable income for the rest of the week or the month? They are scandalised by the amount of pensions being paid to retired, as I say, civil servants, bankers, yes, and politicians too. And I think the government, we have definitive proposals in that regard, and I think the government would do much worse now than take those in hand and implement them. It would show some leadership and it would give some example to people that we are asking year in, year out to bear austerity. How much time have I left, Kayla? Mr. Hall. There's nothing. I don't believe that the forthcoming insolvency legislation is going to make any impact on the question of mortgage arrears. And make no mistake about it, mortgage arrears is a dam waiting to burst in this country. Mortgage arrears is potentially it has the potential of an iceberg threatening the ship of state. 190,000 people in this country, 1 in 5, are in arrears with their mortgage. 30% almost of residential mortgages are either in arrears or have had their mortgage restructured. We're talking here about 450,000 people. 450,000 people living in houses where difficulties have been experienced in mortgage repayments. That is a very, very serious problem. And 50% of house owners with mortgages are in negative equity. 50%. Those are the people whom we're proposing to tax by way of a house tax, a property tax. I mean, I always thought the idea of a wealth tax or a property tax was that you tax an asset. In over 50% of the case of mortgage holders, what we're actually taxing is a debt. This is a new departure. You impose tax on debt. People who are in arrears, people who are in negative equity, people who are struggling to survive, forced to pay a property tax, and water charges is coming down the road. So, these are the issues I think the government has to focus on from here on in. One final point I'd make is this. This budget of 2013 follows its predecessor of 2012 in being a regressive budget. We've had about 8 budgets or so now since the advent of austerity into this country. 2012 was the first one that was regressive. It punished the poor more than the well-off. And budget 2013 continues this trend. People like the government's own think tank, the ERSI, have pointed out that in budget 2012, the poorest 40% of households saw a decrease in their income of 2.5%, while the income of the wealthiest 30% of households decreased by only 0.7%. In other words, the poor were hit 4 times harder than the rich, and the budget of 2013 continued this process.
Next speaker is Deputy Terence Flanagan. Sorry, Deputy, I understand you're sharing your time.
Yeah, I'm sharing with Deputy Michael Creed, 20 minutes for the total slot. Yeah.
10 minutes each. Okay, is that agreed? Agreed. Okay.
Thanks. Yeah. Thank you, Cathaoirleach. I too welcome the opportunity to speak on the Finance Bill 2013. This government has had 3 objectives since it was first elected to office over 2 years ago. And that was to return the country back to stability and to deal with the national finances. The second objective was to repair the banking system and to get Ireland's banks operating correctly and lending again, particularly to enterprise. And the third objective was to restore jobs and economic growth. We know that a lot has been achieved in stabilising the economy and rebuilding the country's reputation internationally and in getting the banking system working. But a lot more work, obviously, to continue in dealing with the unemployment situation, which is totally unacceptable and which this government wants to deal with as a matter of urgency over the coming years. The promissory note has been destroyed. We know that has been replaced and re-engineered with a new long-term government bond, which is very welcome and does provide the necessary breathing space for other options for the government to take in the coming 2 budgets. We know also that there is ongoing work taking place in relation to Ireland's other 50% of our total banking debt, whereby we're looking to get help from the ESM, European Stability Mechanism, to provide financial help to deal with the monies that went in to recapitalise our various Irish banks. This finance bill contains a lot of very good initiatives. Some things are new, and some of the ideas already have been mentioned by Minister Noonan in the budget speech. We know that the primary focus of the budget and of the finance bill is to create jobs and more jobs, and to get Ireland working again. I think that the introduction of the new Jobs Plus scheme later this year will provide grants to employers to encourage them to employ individuals who have been on the live register for greater than 12 months, and that is very much, I think, to be welcomed, and I look forward to hearing further detail on that. The government in this finance bill has decided, obviously and quite rightly so, to focus on SMEs, small and medium enterprises, with a 12-point plan being produced. And we know that small to medium enterprises, they are the key provider of jobs right across the country. They really are the lifebone of this country, and if the domestic economy is to recover in any shape or form, it's crucial that jobs be created in this area, and that we deal obviously with this high unemployment problem, and encourage enterprise and for new people to get involved in forming their own business. We know that over 250,000 people, for instance, in the private sector have lost jobs over the last 4 years, between 2008 and 2011. And really that is, I think, of all the sectors that has massively been affected by the recession. It's really a challenging time, I think, at the moment, and to try and create new jobs obviously is the key. Each of the 12 points contained in the SME plan are designed to help this critical sector to trade, to grow new products, and for enterprise as well to enter into new markets, and to ensure that existing jobs are retained as well as new jobs being created. We know that the SME sector accounts for almost 70% of people employed in Ireland, hence the strong focus in this finance bill towards that sector. I'd like to obviously take the opportunity of putting on the record the great work that Minister John Perry is doing in this area, and as a man who's very committed and who is coming from a business background, he certainly understands the issues, and he is working extremely and exceptionally hard for small to medium enterprises. Some of the measures included in the bill do include a 3-year corporation tax relief for start-up companies, and extending the foreign earnings deduction for work-related travel to certain newly included countries, such as in Africa. It also increases the VAT cash receipts basis threshold from 1 million to 1.25 million. It also amends the close company surcharge to improve cash flows as well for SMEs. We know regarding the R&D, the research and development tax credit, that has been reduced from 75% to 50%. So for an employee, if he's spending half of his time on a weekly basis on R&D initiatives, that company will qualify for the necessary tax credit, and I think that is a much better position than what was previously seen as an onerous position, where it was up to 75% of the time being spent in R&D. The employment and the investment incentive is being amended to include hotels, guest houses and self-catering accommodation, and that will greatly help new employment and existing employment in this industry. We know, for instance, that there is a huge glut of hotels around the country, but that this is such an important industry, particularly in this year, the year of the gathering, and there's 51,000 people employed in the hotel industry, so it's only quite right that it would be included under this incentive. This bill as well, it underpins decisions made in the budget to help farmers and to encourage them, obviously, to continue to restructure whatever operations, if they're selling some land or whatever, that there would be benefit from capital gains tax relief, and that once that money is reinvested back in the farm. As well, should individuals dispose of their assets to their children, there'll be relief from stamp duties on transfer of agricultural lands up to December 2015. And I think that's very good and very concrete. And agriculture, as we know, has been has played such an important role in Ireland over so many years, and we want to see a future for young farmers as well, continuing in this green industry. We know that individuals as well will be allowed under this finance bill to access and to withdraw up to 30% of the value of their AVCs, their additional voluntary contributions, which were made, and AVCs we know are made, they're supplementary benefits on top of one's ordinary retirement benefits. And this obviously is bound to help ordinary people out there who find themselves with cash flow problems and unable to access, or they may not even have other savings. So withdrawals obviously will be taxed because individuals have benefited from tax reliefs initially when they were taking out the AVCs, but that they will obviously have an opportunity to use their money, and hopefully to use their money and spend within the country, because that's obviously what's very much needed at this moment. As previous speaker said there, the aviation sector is also important, and that the Minister has dealt with accelerated capital allowances being provided regarding the construction of hangars, and in relation to as well refurbishment certain buildings or structures to deal with commercial aircraft, and that there will be very generous capital allowances and reliefs there, and that is an industry obviously which has found it difficult obviously with the cost of fuel, but which provides a lot of number of jobs, and a lot of aviation. European headquarters are based here in Ireland, so it's quite rightly that some help should be provided there. Regarding the Living City initiative, I very much welcome that, which is, I know, on a pilot basis, and it's all to do with regeneration, and it's very similar to other urban renewal schemes which were provided in the past. And I know that Waterford and Limerick are two cities which have been selected on the pilot basis, but certainly I hope that Dublin will be included over time as a Dublin deputy, particularly parts of the North Inner City and South Inner City, where there are Georgian buildings which very much could do with encouragement from our owners to go and live in the inner city and to do up these buildings, and this is very much a worthwhile initiative. Regarding cigarettes, the bill does provide for an increase of 10 cents per 20 packets of cigarettes, and I think if we're really to be serious about dealing with smoking, we should be looking at a higher charge per packet of cigarette. So I can say that obviously as a non-smoker, but others may feel differently. But we know that smoking-related illnesses do account for a lot of the reason why people find themselves in hospitals. That there is a new graphic photograph being put on cigarettes, and I think that's very, very important, and to discourage younger people who may start obviously picking up the habit, that this is going to put them off. Now, the National Federation of Retail Agents, NFRN, and other retailers have been on to me regarding this issue, and particularly the President, Joe Sweeney, has stated to me that members are very concerned, particularly about a new European directive, the Tobacco Products Directive, which provides obviously this oversized graphic image, but the fact that the cigarettes now will be in plain packaging, that is a major concern, and it is a blow, I think, to struggling retailers. They're concerned that as a consequence, the whole issue of the black market, which already is a massive...
Just your time's up.
Already is a massive market, that we need to protect this sector, the retail sector. It's Ireland's biggest employer with over 260,000 people employed, which is 14% of our workforce. And by introducing this is going to reduce government revenue. So there certainly is a very genuine concern about that. So I could go on, but I'll finish up there, and just in welcoming this finance bill. Cathaoirleach.
Thanks, Deputy Creed.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach. I welcome the opportunity to say a few brief words on the Finance Bill 2013 and the Finance Local Property Tax Amendment Bill 2013. I suppose, like most people, it's not so much that I welcome the contents of them, but I acknowledge the rationale behind them. There's an old saying down the country in respect of people who come into an inheritance that has been carefully gathered together over many years, that after a gatherer comes a scatterer. And I suppose in respect of where we are as a country today, it's a case of after a scatterer comes a gatherer. Because we've had, regrettably, you know, the inheritance that the country now has is the consequences of many years of untargeted, poorly focused, scattergun approach to public expenditure, and that allied with a banking crisis and collapse and a collapse in our tax base leaves us where we are. And insofar as I welcome the opportunity to speak, it is in the context that I think it provides some clear line of sight for a public out there that are, it has to be acknowledged, suffering from the consequences of the economic recession and the difficult times that we live in. And I think what they yearn for, as much as it is financial relief from the predicament they're in, it is also some degree of certainty. So insofar as, you know, the contents of this bill will not be widely welcomed, they do provide a certainty, not just in respect of the current financial year, but also in respect of the, you know, the medium-term horizon with, you know, the advent of a property tax, water charges, etc. And I suppose I say that also in the context of the current ongoing talks about a successor to the Croke Park Agreement. And there is a perception which is, I suppose, perpetuated perhaps by many of my colleagues in opposition benches, that this is a government that for some reason would be hostile towards public servants. And I want to say, personally, you know, there isn't a family in the country that doesn't have somebody working in the public service, that doesn't have, you know, relations who are guards, teachers, working in the 24/7 alliance aspect, or any other aspect of the public service, front line, back line, middle line, wherever. And there, I acknowledge that this country wouldn't function without those people. And we have to try and provide, you know, as I said, a clear line of sight so that we know where we're going and how we're going to get out of it. And I suppose the thing that has eluded us, regrettably, over the last number of years is, allied to the necessary retrenchment that has gone on, is the growth that we need in our economy. And whilst it has been at very, very low levels, our problem has been that our export markets have been in recession, and that has stymied our recovery prospects. So, you know, I think there is something in this legislation which will provide that line of sight. And, you know, whilst we hope at the end of this year to get out of the bailout agreement, I don't think that in any way, you know, is a cause for jumping up and down or celebrations, because it, to me, is merely a case of moving from the intensive care unit to the critical care unit. We will still be in a very difficult situation, because it's not so much the legacy debt and the high levels of unemployment which are the headline issues of our recession, but it is the fact that there still continues to be a very significant gap between what we earn from taxes every year and what we spend. And that's really where the pain is for people on a daily basis. So, as I said, that's kind of maybe a preliminary or overview to a couple of observations which I want to make. Much has been made about the requirement for a stimulus package, and certainly in the context of employment and unemployment, that's very, very necessary. We had a mini stimulus package last year, which was very welcome, addressing areas such as local authority expenditure and roads, school building programs, etc. But we need much more of it. We need much more of it. And I want to encourage the government and the Minister for Finance and the Taoiseach and their colleagues to acknowledge the fact that the biggest crisis facing householders out there today is the mortgage crisis. Now, if you take it that there are over 100,000 mortgages in considerable difficulty and arrears, if there was relief in the region of €100 per week for each of those mortgage households, over a year that would result in €500 million of additional expenditure being released into the economy. Now, €100 is going nowhere near what is required, and €500 million is nowhere near going to sink the bank's recovery. But we have equipped the banking institutions, the pillar banks in particular, significantly resourced them to deal with this issue. We have the legislative framework in place now to deal with insolvency and to deal with lesser levels of unaffordable debt. And it really is unacceptable that to date there has been no significant willingness by the individual banks to address this issue. And I would ask the government really, and acknowledging what they have achieved in terms of the Anglo demise and the promissory notes, that this is an issue of equal significance to ordinary householders. People may well ask, what was the gain for me in the promissory note? The truth is, probably, relatively speaking, very little, because it means it's not money, additional money we have to spend, but it's less money we have to borrow. But this would be a significant issue for individual householders and would be a boom to the local economy, a stimulus package by another name. And I think that's something that the government needs to move urgently to the top of its priority list. There are no easy solutions. And I understand why banks don't come out with headline figures of we're going to write off 40% of our loan book, or we're going to write off 100,000. It has to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. And there is an issue of moral hazard. The can pay, won't pay issue. But it is an issue that won't go away, has to be dealt with. And I would urge the government to roll up their sleeves on that issue. On a related issue, we celebrate here very often, and rightly so, our success in targeting foreign direct investment. This is a very mobile commodity. We're fortunate that we get a very significant aspect of it here. I think we have over 700 US companies based here, with 115,000 people employed directly in those multinational companies. Now, that's not to be trifled with, and we punch way above our weight in terms of the competition on the global market to attract that here. But the one issue where we are facing a crisis, this was something that I was trying to tiptoe around previously, and being in contact with the IDA and being in contact with the Minister for Enterprise, but it is reaching a crisis stage if we don't start addressing it very soon, and that is the availability of suitable accommodation for those companies that may be willing to relocate here. I come from a provincial town in Cork, and I acknowledge that, not all of the multinational companies can be relocated to those locations. Some can, but we do need a critical mass of that type of infrastructure available to the IDA to market the countries appropriately. And it is regrettably the case that in Cork, in a lot of the other provincial cities, there's very little, if any, of that advanced factory was the term that was used for it in bygone years, but there's very little of that space available now. And we need
just to, you just 1 minute. Yeah.
1 minute?
Well, just over 1 minute.
Oh. We need to move on that, and I would hope that NAMA will play their role in terms of financing and rezoning of the lands which they control. I had a number of other points, I didn't realise it. I welcome the rebate on the fuel issue and its extension to the coach operators and transport operators. That's a kind of an acknowledgement that the tourism sector in particular has a significant role to play. It has been one of the success stories, and as my colleague said in the context of the gathering year, I do think that's something that can be built on. I want to raise an issue specifically, and I would hope that the officials here would bring this to the attention of the Minister, the tax-free status of income from forestry. Now, some of these thresholds or tax-free shelters are being phased out, but there is an issue here in respect of reducing it to 80,000 that there will be an impact on the flow of forestry goods to the market, which could impact on employment downstream in timber processing, etc. And I think there's an issue that needs to be looked at here in terms of 5-year averaging rather than a single approach to that. I am dissatisfied, extremely dissatisfied with the public procurement issue in the Office of Public Works. I think it is displacement by another name. It is being dressed up well in terms of the savings that they hope to make. But I'm not satisfied at all that displacing a local employer on the basis that we're now going to have one single supplier of whether it's books to schools or janitorial services to Garda barracks and schools is necessarily a good thing. I think we need more regional emphasis on that, and we need also, and I'll conclude on this, Carla, because I know you're getting anxious, we need also a weighting in the tendering process for companies who are committed to producing Irish/EU goods as opposed to importing from outside the 27 member states and displacing Irish employers and throwing their employees on the unemployment list. Thank you very much.
Okay, the next speaker is Deputy Thomas Pringle. Deputy, are you expecting 3 speakers as part of this?
No, it's just the 2 speakers.
All right, okay.
Here, look, so
okay, Is
Chair,
that
Ms.
agreed?
Deputy
Agreed,
Higgins.
okay. 20 minutes, but you may, before the slot is over, I'll have to call on the second speaker to adjourn, so just to, okay, Deputy, yeah.
Well, thank you, Gabriel. This Finance Act, I think, has to be taken in the context of the overall budgetary adjustment, where 3.5 billion euros has been removed from the economy this year, and the impact that it's going to have is going to be very significant on everybody and citizens' daily lives. I think it has to be taken in the context of the changes in social welfare, where we've seen the reductions in farm assist payments, which is having a severe impact on rural communities as we speak, as farm assist has been adjusted for recipients across the country, and they're seeing significant reductions in their weekly payments on foot of that. And I think also that then the inclusion of Sunday working in the assessment of job seekers' benefit and job seekers' allowance for claimants will have a significant impact as well. And we see that Fine Gael have constantly spoken about that they're not going to increase taxation, but in the budget speech in December they announced the removal of the PRSI threshold, which for all intents and purposes is increasing taxation, because for people at work, PRSI is part of the tax take out of their weekly salaries. So I think the fact that Fine Gael claim they're not increasing taxation is a fallacy, and it should be seen for what it is. I think the overall adjustment and the overall budget strategy that the government has is wrong. It can't deliver a return to growth that the government intends. There's no stimulus included in any of the projects and the provisions. Some small amounts in the Finance Act here, and I hear other deputies talk about SMEs and how 70% of employment in the country is in SMEs. I wonder just how many SMEs are involved in R&D and how many would have capital, who would have a corporation tax liability, that they'd be able to benefit from any of the measures included in the Finance Act. I would imagine it's probably very few altogether. Section 8 of the Act provides for the taxing of maternity benefit, and I think when you look at this in the context of the proposals by the Minister, seeming proposals by the Minister for Social Protection to actually remove the universal payment on child benefit, it can be seen as an attack on women across the country. And I think the taxing of maternity benefit is a really mean-spirited provision in the Finance Act, and I'd be totally opposed to Section 8 on that basis. Section 5, as I mentioned earlier, it was intended, Section 5, where a lower threshold for key employees involved in R&D has been reduced from 75% to 50%. And as I mentioned earlier, I just wonder if that's been lauded as one of the provisions that's going to help SMEs and help them in their work and to grow their employment. But I don't see any provisions there to stop large multinationals availing of that as well, and I'm not sure how I think that should be included to ensure that it is directed at SMEs and small businesses that may have some research and development aspect to their work, and it should be pitched in a way that doesn't allow for large companies to actually benefit from it and piggyback on that change that takes place. The changes in relation to dirt and capital gains tax, the Labour Party has made much play on the fact that this is a tax on wealth, and as part of the wealth taxes that they have outlined as included in the budgetary measures. But there's no doubt that some very wealthy people are benefiting from dirt and capital gains tax, and the increase will affect them. But it will also affect very many small savers and people who aren't high net worth individuals across the country, and could hardly be decided as tax or as a wealth tax on the small savings that they may have and the increase that the dirt will have in relation to that, and where people may get small inheritances and that the capital gains tax will increase on them. So I don't think that it can be stated to be a wealth tax. I think it's a general tax that is targeting everybody. The one thing that I would wonder about it too is in Section 97 of the Act that provides where property is held by a trustee on behalf of somebody who's involved under the personal insolvency legislation, that if there's any rental income from that property that's taxed will be levied on the person in the personal insolvency situation. And I just think that should be, if that is going to be the case, that the tax should be deducted off the rental income that goes to the trustee and not levied against the individual. Because it seems to me that if somebody's in personal insolvency situation, the fact that they don't have control of the property anymore and the fact that they're not benefiting from the rental income, it shouldn't be a taxable liability on them. And if the section doesn't provide for it, I think it should be amended to ensure that the tax would be collected on the rental income that the trustee collects, and that they would be required to pay it on behalf of the person involved in the personal insolvency. The one thing I would welcome in the Finance Act is that the extension of the fuel rebate to the coach operators and bus operators across the country. I think that is to be welcomed, and it should provide some small benefit to them and some incentive to them to enable them to continue on in business. On excise duty, I do think that there could have been a look at the excise duty on alcohol and maybe look at a way of rebalancing the situation. I was talking to a publican today who was actually just telling me that if he buys a keg of beer, it costs him around about €160, including excise duty and VAT, and he can go into a supermarket and buy the equivalent amount of beer in cans and pay €90 for it. And I mean, that to me doesn't make any sense in our situation, particularly when we see the harm that alcohol is causing in our communities, and it is predominantly through the off sales that the abuse of alcohol is taking place. And I think that we should be looking at rebalancing that, increasing the amount of taxation on off sales, and looking at how to reduce it to ensure to maintain the retail or the publican trade, so that people can drink in a safe environment. And I think that should be looked at. I know there's the Cabinet is due to sign off on an alcohol bill in the coming days, or may have done already, and I think that should be addressed as part of that. Thank you, Kieran.
Thanks, Deputy Higgins.
The Finance Bill 2013 merely carries on the failed austerity policies being implemented for 2 years now by the Fine Gael and Labour parties in this coalition government. That does not stop the Minister for Finance, however, trying to spin the economic figures in favour of the government. Introducing the Finance Bill, the Minister presented growth in gross domestic product in the first 3 quarters of 2012 as 0.8% of GDP, as if this were a success. We have to remind the Minister that the Department of Finance, in December of 2010, after the Troika programme of salvaging the European speculators and bankers on the backs of the Irish working people, forecast that growth in 2012 would be 3.2%, and forecast a fall in unemployment and an increase in the numbers of work. Now, all these forecasts were falsified by the experience of the last 2.5 years. And the reality, of course, is that the austerity programme of cuts and tax increases is playing havoc with the domestic economy, yielding the disastrous unemployment situation, 440,000 or so on the live register. About 80,000 of our people, mainly youth, emigrated last year. And the general difficulty that many people have in surviving. Now, the Minister for Finance, again in introducing the Finance Bill, outlining a growth of 3.2% in exports in the first 3 quarters of last year, indicated that this was a major success. Now, every job in the export sector is, of course, welcome, but the economic crisis and mass unemployment will not be resolved by export growth. Exports arise from areas of the economy that are generally very highly capital intensive, and therefore does not, unfortunately, massively increase the numbers at work relative to the amount of capital that is put in, and does not in any way make up for the damage, the decimation, in fact, that is done to the domestic economy caused by the cuts and tax increases of this government, following on the example of the government of Fianna Fáil and the Green Party. Now, fundamental to job creation is increasing investment. But private investment has collapsed catastrophically in the last 5 years. In Ireland by 64%, according to McKinsey global forecasters. And all over Europe, there is a paralysis of private investment. The financial press last year was indicating that major European corporations were sitting on €3 trillion in the Eurozone and in Britain of accumulated profits that they failed to invest, while 26 million people are unemployed throughout the European Union. The reason, of course, is because they're not confident of getting sufficient profit if they did invest. So European capitalism is on an investment strike in reality. You combine that with the savage cuts in public investment in many, many countries in Europe, and the savage austerity in many countries as well, and we get a Eurozone economy that is in serious crisis. Now, the puny measures in this budget, as far as the Irish state are concerned, are totally inadequate to meet the extent of that crisis. Some of the measures that have been come up with over the last year or two, like so-called job bridge, are really contemptible schemes designed simply to massage the figures, and in the case of that particular scheme, really just providing exploitative packages to take young people off the official lists, but do nothing to resolve the essential, serious problem of providing jobs. So radical measures are needed. Major investment in public infrastructure is needed. Therefore, that's where public funding should go, not going to continue to fund the disastrous bailout of the bankers and the European financial markets. The minister and the government refused absolutely to tax, for example, the top 5% of earners in this state, where we showed in a pre-budget submission that without breaking their hearts, they could afford to pay another 2.5 billion in this year alone. And that going into investment is the type of funding that would be needed, for example, for major infrastructural projects that could take tens of thousands of people, from skilled workers to unskilled, etc., off the dole, and kickstart the economy and create and recreate a growth in the economy. Instead, Fine Gael and Labour bow to the financial markets in carrying out their programme. What we need, in fact, in the European basis, to break the power of the financial markets, take them into public ownership, the major banks and financial institutions, under democratic control of the working class people on a European basis, and on that way use them and direct them towards investment in infrastructure, investment for the good of society, not for the destructive profits of a tiny elite. Now, Cailleach, the property tax is going to be another huge drain on individuals and families if allowed to be implemented in 2013 and onwards. That will further depress the domestic economy, giving a further twist to austerity. Next month, when letters go to every home demanding hundreds of euro to be joined the year after if the government plans are implemented by a water tax that will come close to €1,000 per household, there will be consternation. And there will be a massive campaign, and the campaign of boycott and massive opposition should be fully supported.